Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 135 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with returning guest Lee Miller, all about plants for shade. The plant profile is on Abutilon, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with C.L. Fernari, who shares the last word on growing vegetables from seed. This episode, we're joined by Lee Miller, landscape designer and blogger. She was a previous guest of the GardenDC podcast way back on episode 72, talking all about low-maintenance gardening, and we have her back today to talk about shade gardening. Welcome, Lee.
Oh, hello, Kathy, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So that episode was recorded in August 2021, so it's been a bit more than a year. Any changes or new developments in your horticultural life?
Well, I've been expanding my presentations. I've been doing more speaking engagements for garden clubs, for the local university. That was fun, teaching the students and seeing their eyes light up and see their interest in landscape design. So we have some future designers coming along, and working on the blog and just kind of keeping busy. I love to write. I'm constantly on reading, articles on horticulture and just kind of keeping update on everything. And winter's a good time to do that as well. When the season's a little bit slower, to do some reading and some catching up.
And you had time to write a new book. So that book is titled Shade Gardening for the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, a guide to planning the ultimate shade garden.
Yes. That one, it came about through so many of my clients getting increased number of calls for shade gardens. And it's been over the last couple of years. So I think it's because a lot of the gardens here, especially in this area on Long Island, but all over, as the trees mature, it's becoming more and more shade. And also as a next door neighbor, for example, builds a shed or some kind of structure, or they have trees on their property, I get a lot of calls saying to me, Lee, what can I do? I can't tell my neighbor to chop down their trees, but my garden's all shady and I don't know what to do. So that's really what encouraged the writing of the book.
Yeah, and so many of us have a shady portion of our landscape, if not a full shade garden. And, as your garden matures, it becomes more and more and more shady, right?
Correct. You can even have, for example, southwestern exposure, but if the neighbor has trees that are on the south side or the western side, you have shade. So even though you have the southern sun, it doesn't matter.
I was going to say that shade gardening is actually one of the most pleasant kind of gardenings I find versus full sun or being out in the July-August vegetable patch because, of course, it is shady.
Absolutely. And what's nice, you can introduce a bench or a walkway or a fountain or statue, and that pretty much says, come on, come visit, come sit down and enjoy the shade garden.
And we should probably define shade, Lee, and talk about maybe the differences between deciduous and evergreen shade.
Okay, certainly. Basically, you have partial shade or you have full shade. Partial shade is about 3 to 6 hours of light a day. That could be an northern or eastern exposure, or even, as I had mentioned, it could be southern or western if there's trees in the area that are blocking the light. Full shade is less than 3 hours of light, but you have to have some element of light. You can't have 100% shade. There has to be some kind of filtered or dappled light coming through, because plants, of course, do need some lighting for survival.
That's such a good point, Lee, that, 100% shade, as in darkness, nothing can make chlorophyll, pretty much.
Right.
I mean, there are some cave-dwelling creatures and plants, but that's going to be pretty tough in our landscape. And really quick, you had mentioned you're based in Long Island. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how your garden is doing and the weather.
It's been one of the strangest winters, and it's been like this for the last couple of years. It's January, Kathy, and we are getting temperatures in the upper 40s and 50s, a lot of rain, no snow. There are concerns. I've had clients emailing me, asking me what's going to happen if we do get the deep freeze, because we don't have the insulation from the snow. And today is more like March. We have winds coming off the water with gusts, and it's just been very, very strange. And I think our gardens are going to be changing along with our weather patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds very similar to a typical mid-Atlantic winter. Here we might get 1 or 2 inches of snow, then it melts the next day, then maybe a dusting a couple weeks later. And then every once in a while we get, walloped with, a foot or more of snow. And then that's unusual, but it usually melts after a week. We don't have that steady snow ground cover, snow cover on all the surfaces that insulates everything. Ours usually melts pretty quickly. And then we have that constant freeze-thaw cycle.
Right. And plants are very resilient. They do adjust, but it has been a little bit on the crazy side, very unusual type of weather.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking shade gardening, and especially our favorite plants for shade gardening. But before we dive into those plants, let's talk some shade gardening principles. So if I have a new home and say a shady backyard, what are the first considerations I might make?
First thing you want to do is monitor the area and figure out exactly just how much lighting you are getting. I say that to my clients all the time. Observe the lighting, observe the moisture, the soil. You have to look at those things before you start choosing your plants, just to have an idea to get you started.
That's a good point, Lee, because dry shade and wet shade are a million miles between, right? There's so much different plants. And I am blessed and cursed with a ton of dry shade because it's under large, shallow-rooted oak trees that like to suck up all the moisture underneath them. Whereas I have neighbors who have really wet shade backing onto stream beds or along parkland down a valley, so that they're really sitting in wet.
Right. Well, that could be difficult, but you can if you pick the right plant for the right place, you can have success.
All right, so let's talk about some of those plant choices. So in your book, your first chapter is on evergreen trees and shrubs for shade. And those are obviously ones that have foliage most of the year, if not all of the year on them. So what are some of your favorites?
Oh, there's so many to choose from. I like to choose for foliage. The Japanese akuba, the gold dust plant, it's so beautiful. It has those broad leaves with the green background and then the little specks of gold. And that really brightens up the shade garden. There's also another one, which has become a favorite over the last few years. It's called Osmanthus goshiki. It's green and white foliage, but the new foliage comes in with shades of beige, pink, and gold. And even now in the winter time, I had just posted on my last blog post, you can see the gold and pink tips. And it's just so beautiful. There's also, of course, cherry laurel, skip laurel, mountain laurels, a lot of broadleaf evergreens. Lakothe is beautiful. There's one called Rainbow that has shades of cream and green and pink to the leaves. It has kind of a drooping feature to it. It even gets little white blooms in the springtime. Oh, I can go on and on and on, but it's some beautiful foliage.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit more in detail. And I love the osmanthus as well, because you get also a little bit of flowering and that beautiful scent as well from them.
Yes. It's beautiful.
And so you mentioned in some of your favorite evergreens in the book, you also have Daphne and Camellia, which I find to be not the easiest plants for beginning gardeners. Any tips for those two?
They have to be in the right place. The Daphne, it likes a very woodland type of setting. As far as you see the winter time, you might want to spray the leaves with an antidesicant. The Camellia, I haven't really had any problems with it. There's one called Yuletide, which seems to do very well. I'm sure that there's certain varieties, some do better than others, but that one I've been pretty successful with.
I agree. Yuletide is probably a great choice, and because it does bloom more late fall, early winter, and carry those blooms over the winter time, that can be a beautiful addition to the winter garden.
Yes.
And so another evergreen that you recommend is the boxwood green gem.
Yes. That is a perfect shrub because it only gets 2 to 3 feet max. It's perfect for shade. It's low maintenance. All you need is, you can either let it go freeform or you can do a slight pruning in the spring after it pushes out new growth. And as far as the boxwoods, there is another one called New Gen, which is more disease resistant. But as far as boxwoods, everybody says that as far as the fungal infections, I think all you really have to do is keep an eye on it. And if you see something happening to it, spray it with a fungicide and spray it with an antidesicant in the winter time to prevent drying. But it's such a nice plant, and there's also a variegated one, which is gorgeous. If you want to bring some color, it has the green and the yellow in it. If you want to bring some color into a shade area.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned the antidesicants. And so those can be used on a lot of our broadleaf evergreens. So that could be your rhododendron, the camellia you mentioned, the boxwoods. And because they can get a lot of damage from that dry winter wind, but also maybe if you're in a salty type of climate, getting salt air, that can help as well.
Yes, if it prevents the water loss from the leaves, and it works very well.
And when you apply the antidesicant, do you do it on the top and bottom of the leaves?
You try to get as much surface area as you possibly can, and it is organic, so that you're not putting any chemicals into the environment. It's perfectly safe for that. And you spray it when the temperatures are in the 40s, 50s. You have to be very careful not to spray it if you know you're going to have freezing temperatures, because you need quite a few hours for it to dry. So the best time, I always tell people, sometime in November, December, it's the best bet to spray.
And it also helps for some insect issues as well.
Yes, it actually smothers some of the larvae for the insects.
Yes, like I think scale insects in particular,
Yes.
If you're having an issue with those, that might be something for you to try.
Yes, exactly. And another point, you can also use a dormant oil in springtime. Well, springtime or fall, you can apply it to smother the insects.
And then again, you were talking about not applying when it's too cold. You also don't want to apply when it's too hot.
Yes, there's a happy medium because you don't want to accidentally fry the foliage.
Yeah, that would not be good.
No.
Basically cooking it at that point.
Right.
Another beautiful evergreen you have pictured in the book is the Ilex aquifolium argentea marginata. And that's a mouthful just to say variegated English holly. What do you like about that English holly?
Oh, I just love the foliage. I'm a big fan of foliage, and I just love the coloration. Once again, the yellows and the greens mixed in. And I don't consider it, a lot of people consider hollies prickly. I don't consider it that prickly. I just love its growing nature, and it's just a beautiful plant.
And you do have several other hollies noted in the book, including, of course, the American holly, Satyr Hill, which has beautiful berries.
Oh, yes. Yes, beautiful berries. And the Nellie Stevens has beautiful berries, and they're wildlife friendly. The birds can eat the berries during the winter time. There's another one called Hugendorn, which I write quite a bit about. It is very similar to a boxwood, but not prone to the blight, the fungal issues. It's compact. It gets 2 to 3 feet in height, a round form, and it's perfect for either, you can put it in the woodland garden, you can put it in foundation planting in shade, and it can be combined with so many other wonderful shade plants. So that's a good one, the Hugendorn.
And do you have any pruning tips for those?
Simply prune after it pushes out new growth in spring, as you would do with most of your evergreens. Let it push out and then prune it.
Thanks for that. And so your next chapter is all about deciduous trees and shrubs for shade. And you call the evergreen the backbone of the garden, and the deciduous the structure. I guess we could call it the rest of the skeleton.
Absolutely. There's what I call 3 main layers to the landscape. You have your backbone, as we just mentioned, which are the evergreens, which are evergreen all year long and provide you with that color. And then the deciduous plants. There's some really beautiful, the maples are gorgeous. There's one called coral bark maple. It doesn't like a lot of sun. A lot of people mistake that and they think it wants the sun, but it doesn't. It'll get scorched. It prefers a partially shaded area. And the thing with the coral bark maple is that in the wintertime, the new branches are this vibrant coral, as the name, coral color, red, like a reddish pink. And the colder it gets, the more it glows. So on a snowy day, when that snow is coming down, if we ever get snow again, as the snow is coming down, those branches just glow. And in the springtime, it has a beautiful light green foliage, which turns to a medium green, and then in the fall it lights up with like a yellowish orange color. So that tree provides interest all year long. There's also the eastern redbud, which I have it on my eastern side of my property. It's beautiful. I have the weeping one. And in the springtime, before the foliage emerges, it gets these beautiful purple flowers. It just fills the entire tree, and then the foliage comes in, which is beautiful, large, like heart-shaped foliage. So that's another beauty. Even in the wintertime, it looks nice because you have the weeping structure. So that's what I mean by structure, which adds further interest to the garden.
And on the redbuds, there are so many recent introductions, golden versions, chartreuse versions. Have you tried out any of those?
I don't have any personally on my property, but I planted a few of the ones with the deep burgundy foliage. They're beautiful. And I know the clients have had them for a long time, so they've been very successful.
Yeah, they're so gorgeous. And so another understory tree that you recommend is our native serviceberry, the Amelanchier.
Yes.
And do you find that you get a lot of berries in a shade situation, but the tree still thrives?
The tree still thrives. It still gets the blooms. Now, mind you, you have to have some filter. You have to have some sun coming in. You don't want to put that in deep shade. You want to it has to get some light to it. But it is a native, and it's a hardy plant, and it does perform well.
Yeah, I just love that one for harvesting the berries yourself and sharing them with the wildlife.
Yes, absolutely.
So you also recommend the Japanese dogwood, or Cornuscusa, which is also called Korean dogwood green sleeves. And that actually looks more like a shrub than a small tree, I would say.
It depends on how you buy it. You can either, I have one on my property. I absolutely love it. It has a short trunk, and then with the canopy, the kind of rounded canopy, or you can get it with several trunks coming up, which actually does make it look more like a shrub. But the green sleeves, I discovered that one several years back. The blooms are absolutely magnificent, even more so than your traditional Kusa dogwood. They have a little bit of a greenish hue, hence the name. They last a lot longer. And the fruit, my tree is covered with fruit at the end of the season. I've planted them in many gardens, and every single client says, Lee, I absolutely love this tree. So if you can get the green sleeves, that's a good one.
I'm going to be on the lookout for that myself, because I have wolf eyes, and I have not had one bloom on that wolf eyes. I mean, it has beautiful foliage, but this sounds incredible.
It is, and they don't always have it, but if you ask, maybe they can get it for you.
And so moving on to some deciduous shrubs for shade, you mentioned hydrangeas, in particular, the macrophylla and paniculata.
Yes, and hydrangeas are so beautiful, and there's so many different varieties. A favorite one that I've been using in the shade gardens is the oak leaf variety, Ruby Slippers. It has the beautiful leaves that look like oak trees, and it gets white blooms, and then the white blooms fade to pink as the fall comes in, and it gives you a really nice show. Another hydrangea that I've been using in shade gardens is limelight, the limelight tree hydrangea. I have one garden. We had the evergreen backdrop, and then we had several of the limelight hydrangeas. We had 3 of them, and that was the middle layer. And then we mixed in all the other things and yews, and we didn't talk about perennials yet, but the coral bells and the sedges and all that. Hydrangeas are just beautiful, and they can go just about anywhere.
Yeah, I love the way they look, especially the oak leaf ruby slippers that you mentioned. That's more of a dwarf form than the straight species of the oak leaf hydrangea, which can get, 8 to 10 feet.
Right. So depending on the variety, you can use it as your backdrop, or you can use it in the foreground.
And so another deciduous plant that you highlight is the Hypericum, the St. John's wort, and you specify the cultivar Magical Universe. I'm not familiar with that cultivar. Can you tell me a little bit about that one?
I fell in love with it. I saw it at the nursery. It's more of a dwarf form. It only gets about 2 foot high. Mine's about that now, and I've had it for several years. The flowers are beautiful, the yellow flowers that it gets. But what I like even more is the fruit. After the flowers fade, it lasts throughout the entire winter. So I'm getting this interest all season long. So it's a beauty.
Sounds gorgeous. And that's definitely a low-growing deciduous plant.
Yes, so that can go in the foreground.
And another kind of shorty, depending, I guess, on the cultivar you pick, is the Itea virginica, and you pick the cultivar Merlot.
Yes, that's another beauty. Low, like you said, low-growing, mixes in with a lot of different perennials in front of it, and that's another wonderful addition to the shade garden.
And you end the chapter with Viburnum trilobum, which is the American cranberry bush. And I know it grows well for you in the Northeast. I'm just wondering how well it will do for us here in the Mid-Atlantic. I don't know too many people growing our native cranberries.
I'm not sure how well it would do there. It does, like you said, it does well here. And that brings us to another thing. When you're planting your shade garden, always know what zone you're in. Don't buy, if you're getting something, don't get it just because it says it's for your zone. You want it to be hardy 2 zones below, 1 to 2 zones below, or 1 to 2 zones above for complete success.
That's good advice, especially since we just talked about the changing weather patterns,
right?
And either milder or colder winters, things are going to fluctuate wildly back and forth. And so the cranberry bush is listed in your book as zones 2 through 8, which is a very broad zones. But if you're in 7, 8, that might be kind of pushing it.
Right. 7, I don't personally have it in my yard, but I've seen it at many arboretums, and it's doing very well in 7. But like you said, 8 might be so-so.
And then that brings us to the wonderful category of perennials for shade. And so a lot of them are beautiful foliage, but also beautiful flowers. So let's start with the lady's mantle. And that I find does well in wet shade, but not so much in dry shade.
Right. It likes a lot of moisture. And what's beautiful about the lady's mantle is the foliage. It does get those beautiful little yellow blooms, but it's all about the foliage because it collects the raindrops and they glisten in the sunlight. It does. I have it growing in my shade garden, and it does require quite a bit of moisture. It doesn't like to dry out.
Yeah, and as you said, the sparkle of the water drops sitting on the leaves is part of the charm of the plant. So if you don't have that moisture or that constant dampness, it's going to be tough for you.
Exactly.
And next you have the, this surprised me to be a shade perennial listing, is the Japanese anemone, because I find that more to be part sun to full sun. But how are you using it in the shade?
I would say actually it does. I would say more partial shade. I find it does. That's an interesting pick because that one, it will do well in full sun. It will also do well in partial shade. I wouldn't go too shady on it, but it's versatile.
Yeah, I do think it's one of those plants that can span from part shade to part sun situations. If it's in really beating down afternoon hot sun, it'll get crispy. And then, of course, if it's in deep shade, you're probably not going to get flowers.
Right. Yeah, so you have to find that happy medium.
And I love the next one you mentioned, which is the Aurelia cordata Sun King. Just because the name is Sun King, it seems like a weird choice for shade.
Garden.
But I think it's because it brings the sun to the shade.
That's a beauty. And even though it's a perennial, it looks more like a shrub. It has that beautiful golden foliage to it that really lights up the shade garden. That's definitely a winner in my book.
That is all about the foliage.
About the foliage.
And it's a beautiful chartreuse, you would even say, very yellow-green. And the flowers are kind of like, it gets flowers.
Right, insignificant flowers. It's more about the foliage. And then you can also get the black ornamental berries on it later in the season. But yeah, it's a beauty.
Yeah, kind of like a little sprinkle of flowers and then the berries later.
Right.
And so the next is a funny one, Aruncus goat's beard, because I always think of that as like the bigger, hairier cousin of astilbe, which you also include in the book. So can you compare and contrast the Aruncus to the astilbe and what situations you would use either of those? I
kind of agree that it's the larger cousin of the astilbe in a way, because it resembles an astilbe, but it's much larger. So that you would use maybe a little bit more towards the backdrop versus astilbe, maybe a little bit more forward in your garden. I love the flowers. The flowers is that wispy, kind of creamy off-white. It's a pretty plant.
And the astilbe, where would you use that in the garden?
There's so many different varieties. One of my favorites is the peach blossom, which is a peachy color. Astilbe you would combine with your golden sedges and your hostas and your brunera. It goes with so many different things. You could also combine it with your evergreens. It goes beautifully with actually next to anything, like even a spreading yew. You have the dark green of the spreading yew, and then you bring in the color of the pot from the astilbes, and they come in. You have peach, you have purple, lavender, white, red. So many things to choose from, and they vary in heights too. So you can get the lower ones, the shorter ones are more like a ground cover, and then you can go all the way up. There's one called Visions in Red, which is absolutely knockout. Gorgeous every July. It always blooms around the 4th of July for me. And the blooms are these large purple blooms. And that one gets a good 3 feet in height with the blooms on it.
Mm-hmm. And again, another wet shade lover versus dry shade.
Yes, absolutely.
And so we're coming now to Brunnera. Some people say Brunera, depends on how you pronounce it, or Siberian bug gloss, which is an unfortunate common name. It sounds so weird, but it is one that I love. It's a nice clumping plant, and I find it's a great substitute for hostas. And I think you've marked it as deer resistant. So maybe we can talk now a little bit about some deer resistant shade perennials.
Sure. First, a note as far as the Brunera, that is one of my favorites. That's one of the most attractive shade plants as far as the beautiful, large, glossy, heart-shaped foliage and the little specks of silver and sprays. It's just so pretty. It is deer resistant, and some of the other deer resistant, one of my favorites, and I use it a lot, but there's a reason why I use it a lot. It's the golden Japanese sedge. And I have two favorites. It's Evergold and Everillo. The Evergold is more of a golden carex, whereas the Everillo, their Evercolor series, it has yellow on the inside of the grass-like foliage with green on the outside. Now, the thing about that is it's evergreen. It's shade loving. You don't have to do a thing to it. The only thing, if you have a harsh winter and you get a little tiny bit of burning on the tips, you just cut them off in the spring. And of course, it's deer resistant. You also have the mondo grass is deer resistant. A lot of the ferns are deer resistant. Hellebores are absolutely gorgeous. They're blooming right now. One of my favorites is Shooting Star. It's pinkish white blooms, and the blooms they're not blooms, they're bracts, and they last for months and months and months. I have 3-4 different types, and it takes me all the way through March, so those are deer resistant. Astilbe is deer resistant in quotes, and so is Liriope, variegated Liriope. Those are beautiful. For the most part, deer will not touch them. Once in a while, you'll have a rare case where they're sampling, and they might nibble, but they're considered deer resistant. I'm sure that there's others. There's I'll come up with them. there's other deer resistance as well.
No worries. Yeah, I think that's a great selection, and I'm glad you highlighted hellebores in particular, just because A, they're blooming now and or about to bloom in a lot of people's gardens. They don't mind being in almost deep shade and will still bloom for you. And as you noted, they're critter resistant.
Right. And I just thought of another one, Epimedium. Barrymore, that's deer resistant, and it's also drought tolerant once it gets established. So that's another nice one, and the foliage is gorgeous on that as well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Epimedium myself. For in dry shade, you do have to water for the first year or two to get it established, but then after that, it's good on its own.
And it covers. It's a nice. I call it a ground cover.
Yeah. I would say perennial / ground cover. A native cultivar that you're recommending also for the shade is Chelonia Hot Lips, and that's also known as turtle head. So that one, I find, again, you're not going to get as much flowers if you put it in the shade.
Once again, go for part shade on that one. But that's an interesting plant. I love the flowers on that one. They call it turtle head. I guess it kind of looks like a turtle popping his head out of the shell with the flowers that are kind of a pinkish purple.
Yeah, they're very, I guess, snapdragon-like is the best or closest that you could say for the flower shape itself.
Right, it's different.
And you also cite hardy cyclamen, which is also kind of a different flower shape and has a nice basal growth on the ground. And you're listing that again as a deer-resistant choice, so we can add that to the deer-resistant category.
And let's see, Ajuga. Ajuga, my favorite is Black Scallop because it has the larger leaves and the purple flowers. That's deer-resistant.
Nice. Yep, so we have some great choices there. And the common foxglove, Digitalis purpurea, you've listed that in here. Does that reseed for you, or it comes back from the same mother plant and expands?
It reseeds. And that, as you know, that one, you're getting different plants, but it's biennial. So what happens is it blooms and then it reseeds itself, and it just keeps spreading throughout the garden. And it's perfect underneath the shade trees.
Yeah, that one is one that I'm going to have to experiment and grow more of, because for me in the dry shade, it doesn't reseed as well. But maybe I'll give it a little bit more babying. And so we're up to heuchera and those beautiful coral bells. And since we talked a lot about hellebores, I kind of feel like heuchera and brunnera and hellebore should be the heart of anyone's shade garden.
Yes, and they all go well together as well. Out of all the coral bells, and I've tried many, the best two from experience are Palace Purple and Caramel that I've found. The Palace Purple is that deep burgundy color, and the Caramel looks like caramel. And those two, whereas I find the other coral bells die back. There's also one called Paris, which is really nice too. But a lot of the coral bells, they kind of die back. They don't look so as well during the wintertime. The Palace Purple and the Caramel, I enjoy those all winter long. And yes, towards spring, the foliage might start getting a little crispy. But then I just run my fingers through it in spring and get rid of the crispy foliage and let the new foliage come up. And just one note on the coral bells, which is very important. If we do get that frost heaving, the frost and then the thaw and then the frost and the thaw, they may push up out of the ground. So all I do is simply, I lightly step on it and push it down into the ground so that it protects the roots. That's the only thing you have to watch out for with the coral bells.
Yeah, I agree. You might want to check on your heuchera every few weeks throughout the winter for frost heaving. That's just pushing the roots up out of the ground, and then they're kind of exposed to the elements.
Right.
And so we can't talk about shade gardening or favorite shade plants without talking about hostas. So what are some of your favorite hosta varieties? My
favorites are Francis Williams, with those glorious large leaves that with the gold and green. Shadowland is magnificent if you can get a hold of one of those. They aren't the easiest to find. I did manage to find it in a local nursery years ago. It has the green, gold, and cream, and that's a medium-sized one. Patriot is a nice one too. It has it's green and white, but a lot more white in it, similar to Minuteman, which is green and white, but I think the Patriot is a lot more striking. And there's also the blue hostas. Those are beautiful. You have the Cadet, which is the small one, and then you have the larger varieties they can get up to, I've seen them 2 to 3 feet in width in the shade garden. And lots of times family and clients and friends, they'll ask me, when should I divide it? And I think they're just so gorgeous. Leave it alone. It's beautiful. They're absolutely magnificent.
Yeah, I agree. Leave that giant clump there. Yeah. I mean, unless you really need to fill in spaces, it's gorgeous.
Right. And then there's little ones too. There's baby ones, miniature ones, which are beautiful. And there's one that I came across just recently. I actually saw it at the local arboretum. It's called curly fries. I don't know if you ever heard of that one. It doesn't have the wide leaves. It has elongated foliage that's curly on the edges, and it's more on the yellow side. It's a really cool plant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a big fan of curly fries, and there's a couple other miniatures I love that are in the mouse family, like mouse ears, Minnie Mouse. Those are so cute.
Those were the dwarf ones I was thinking of. Yeah, the Minnie Mouse are adorable. Mouse ears.
So we can't leave shade perennials without talking about pulmonaria or lungwort.
That's a beauty. Now, I have mine growing in the back shade garden. It gets really only a few hours of sun a day, green foliage with white polka dots, and then it gets pink buds. In the early spring, it has pink buds, and then the pink buds open up in the variety I have to bluish purple flowers. And it does well all summer long, and the foliage just keeps getting better and better. I find in wintertime, though, because I've had it a few years now, in the wintertime, you start losing some of the foliage. It stays partially evergreen, but then any foliage that turns brown and gets mushy, you have to get rid of that. And then they'll be fine. Mine's actually pushing out new leaves, believe it or not, because it's been so mild. But as long as you get rid of the mushy, you don't want to, you don't want to encourage any fungal issues.
Exactly. Plus, it's just a little unsightly, just gets a little more tidier that way. And so you have a whole chapter on shade-loving annuals, and I was pleased to see that because I see so many books on shade gardening that don't even address annuals at all. Like they just completely ignore the annual category, and I think that's a shame because they're great for filling in spots or for shade containers.
Absolutely. Of course, impatiens they just bloom all season long. And they even have the new hardier varieties because for a while there was an issue with them, but they're doing fine now. Coleus. Oh my goodness. Coleus, the foliage on that. There's so many different varieties. Sweet potato vine. It comes in yellow or purple. That's your spiller, so to speak, that's you can put into a container. And one of my favorite container plantings it can be in your shade garden, but it can also be underneath your overhang on your porch is where I have mine. And that is a combination of different varieties of coleus. So we have pinks and greens and reds and oranges. I combine all the coleus, whatever fits in the pot. And then I take the sweet potato vine and cascade that over the edges. And I combine the two varieties, the golden green and the burgundy, and that looks absolutely gorgeous. And of course, there's violas. Who doesn't love violas? Mm-hmm. They're so pretty. And elephant's ear. That you just stick in the pot, and boy, is that so much fun. I had one year that was taller than I was, and I had fun hiding behind the leaves.
Yeah, and I also noted if you're not a big fan of impatiens or, still having trouble with them, you have Tyrinia and Browillia. And that's two varieties of floriferous, flowers after flowers after flowers all summer long, annuals. So I really love those as substitutions for impatiens or, just as an alternative.
The Tyrinia is especially really pretty. I like that one. The blue flowers are really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it comes kind of, in the purpley range of flowers. And then Browillia, same kind of more the purpley pastel side of things. And you also, when you mentioned the elephant's ear, kind of their smaller cousin are the caladiums.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Those are beautiful as well. So, yeah, and these plants you can either combine in your shade garden. If you want to, some people like to give a nice tropical feel, so you can throw some of those caladiums in there or elephant ears and do that. Or you can put them in the planters, as we had mentioned.
And so you close out the book with shade inspiration, with some photos of shade gardens, and also shade gardening maintenance tips. So let's talk about some of those shade gardening maintenance tips.
Sure. Shade gardening is beautiful. And as we mentioned, if you have the right plants in the right place, you can have a beautifully successful shade garden. There's a couple things you do have to watch out for with shade. Number one, I would recommend trying to water with drip irrigation. You really don't want a lot of water laying on the leaves. If you do have mist heads and the water's getting leaves, you just have to watch out. Monitor your plants. If you see spots or holes in the leaves, that could be a sign of a fungal infection, and then you want to treat as needed. That's the only thing you have to watch out for. That's the biggest concern with the shade.
And one of the pros of shade gardening, of course, is fewer weeds popping up. So you have a little bit less maintenance that way. And then you mentioned mulching.
Yes, mulch has so many benefits. It keeps in the moisture. It adds organic matter to the soil and to the plants. It moderates the soil. I have so many clients ask me, as far as the mulching, and it's important all year long. It's important in the summertime to cool the soil. It's important in the wintertime to warm the soil. So it's a moderator, and that's so very important for the plants. But you have to make sure that you don't never pile your mulch up around the plants. I see that way too often. It smothers them. So you want to just a thin layer, 2 to 4 inches, and keep it away from the main base of the plant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also the edges of your house,
Yes.
A few inches back, especially if you have wood shingles. That's a precaution. You don't ever see that on the bags of mulch, but they really should put that on there.
They really should. Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about shade combinations. So we talked a lot about our specific favorite plants, but how to put them together.
Okay, one of my favorite combinations of all time, and it's very simple, is the golden variegated sedge, the carex. Put that with the caramel coral bells, and you can combine that also with black mondo grass. So you have the golden sedge, you've got the caramel coral bells, and you've got the black mondo grass. It is absolutely spectacular. You can also do, like as far as the evergreens I had mentioned, if you do the darker evergreens, brighten it up along, like with some liriope or some Japanese forest grass is also very pretty. I try to get a lot of the golds in there and the burgundies to mix that in. The ajuga I just love the foliage of ajuga, and it's great along the front of the garden, and then you get the purplish blooms in the springtime. The possibilities are endless. There's so many things you can do with a shade garden, and so many people underestimate the shade garden, but you can really have a lot of fun with it.
And I'm glad you mentioned a lot of those variegated or chartreuse or light colored leaf plants, because they do really brighten up the shade, and make things kind of pop. So say if you had all solid colored ferns and hostas, it just wouldn't be the same.
Right. It's all about combining the foliage and getting a little bit of evergreen, get a little bit of flowering, get the structure. It's just, and you play with it. You said there's a few rules as far as what you make sure you're using the right plants, but you can have fun and play with all the different possibilities that you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're talking about the color side of things, but also the texture.
Yes, like the curly fries hosta that we were talking about earlier.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. All right. So any final thoughts for our listeners, Lee, on shade gardening?
Well, I would say if you've ever felt intimidated as far as shade gardening, don't be. Just see the amount of lighting you have, the amount of moisture you have, and go to the nursery and pick out what you like, and make sure you read about the zone. But just kind of go with it and just enjoy it and make it your own.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Lee, for sharing about your new shade gardening book. How can our listeners get in contact with you?
I have a blog called A Guide to Northeastern Gardening. It's landscapedesignbylee.blogspot.com, or you can simply search A Guide to Northeastern Gardening. There's over 350 articles on there, all to do with gardening, and I post on the 1st and 15th of every month. And there's a link on there to my other blog, and there's a link on there to my books as well. And as far as my book is concerned, you can just go on Amazon and search for Lee Miller Gardening, Lee Miller Gardening, and they'll pop up.
Thank you so much, Lee.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today.
Abutilon plant profile. Abutilon is a small shrub or tree known commonly as the flowering maple. It has beautiful showy flowers in a wide range of colors. typically yellows, reds, and oranges, some with unique markings. Biltmore Ballgown is an heirloom variety from the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. It has beautiful dangling tiger stripe blooms. Abutilon is a member of the mallow family and is a relative of hollyhocks, okra, and cotton. It is native to the subtropics and the tropics. It is reportedly deer-resistant due to the fuzzy leaves, which some people report can cause a skin reaction, so wear gloves when handling it. In our region, Abutilon is not hardy and is sold as an annual or a houseplant. You can put them outside for the summer and overwinter them in their containers in a sunny room or greenhouse. If you do this, beware that it is susceptible to whitefly infestations. They love to be in bright, indirect sun. Plant them in good, rich soil with plenty of moisture, especially on hot days when it can wilt. It flowers on new growth, so prune as needed to encourage branching. Abutilon, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, I took a little visit over to Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland, and saw that the Japanese apricot Prunus mume is already blooming in the fragrance garden, and I even spotted some daffodils showing color as well as some crocus, so spring is near. In the local gardening world, some upcoming events you might want to attend include Maryland's Rare, Threatened, and Endangered Species, an online talk that takes place on Monday, January 30th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's free to register at montgomeryparks.org. Carey Wexted, a master naturalist, will teach about 1,200 species that have been listed as rare, threatened, or endangered in Maryland. Also happening locally, on Friday, February 10th, meet your neighbors, Bark and Bud's Winter Tree Walk with Right Proper Brewing. Join Casey Trees for their first neighborhood walk of 2023 and warm up while learning about the winter characteristics of trees. They'll start off at Casey Trees' office in the Brookland neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and they'll stop at the Right Proper Brewing Company along the way for a chat, a beverage, or both. You can find out more about that event at caseytrees.org. On Sunday, February 12th at 2 p.m. is a talk on getting ready for spring, ideas for natural landscaping and spring container gardens. This is a program hosted by the Sandy Spring Museum's Garden Club, and you can find out more about it at sandyspringmuseum.org. The speaker is Carey Engel, the greenhouse manager of Valley View Farm Garden Center and Nursery. Happy gardening!
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turf grass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million American adults converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn, knowing how and when to replace your turf, and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants and an incredibly useful chart giving you all the specifics on each of those choices for a quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea what a beautiful lawn should be. Available February 7th, 2023, and you can pre-order it now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org. In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. Whether you're growing edible plants or beautiful flowers, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in The Urban Garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
This is my last word about growing vegetables from seed. I'm the garden lady, C.L. Fernari, and one of my favorite things in the summer is being able to walk into my vegetable garden at 5 o'clock and ask, "What's for dinner?" There are usually 4 or more answers, all fresh and flavorful. Since I've worked in a local garden center for years, I know that some people are hesitant to grow vegetables from seed. Sometimes they want the instant satisfaction of buying a squash plant and putting it in their raised beds or into the ground on the same day. I totally get the appeal of this. We lead busy lives, so for many, monitoring whether their seeds are still moist or have germinated is just a bit much. But by limiting your vegetables to those that can be found already started in pots or 6-packs, you're missing out on some great varieties. Let me give you a couple examples. I would not be without Tuscan kale in my garden. This is one of the most long-producing crops you can grow. You just pick the oldest leaves and let the plant grow taller and taller, and you will have kale to harvest from early in the summer into the winter months. Tuscan kale is sometimes called lanceolito or dinosaur kale, but whatever name you use, it's not always available in plant form, and yet it's easy to grow from seed. I love the green and yellow variety of summer squash called Zephyr. And by the way, that's spelled Z-E-P-H-Y-R. It has a great nutty flavor, and it's one of the most mildew-tolerant zucchini varieties there is. When all of my other summer squash plants have succumbed to powdery mildew, Zephyr keeps putting out new foliage and new flowers, even though the older leaves are infected. My husband and I eat a salad from our garden pretty much every night of the week from mid-June into December. And this is possible because we grow lettuce, arugula, and mustard from seed about every 2 or 3 weeks. By planting new short rows of these seeds every 2 or 3 weeks, we always have fresh greens to harvest. We do the same with cilantro and dill seeds so that these tasty herbs are available in our garden all summer long. And this is good because there are seldom young plants to buy in the garden center in July or August. But we know we'll have cilantro and dill because in the spring we bought extra packets of seeds. Beyond availability, seeds make sense financially. For the price of a 3-pack or 6-pack of plants at the garden center, I can have dozens, sometimes even hundreds of seeds. And my last word in this last word segment is that starting plants from seed is truly one of the most life-affirming things we can do.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at washingtongardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.